Roy, I see you. I'm gonna make you a co-host so you can not so yeah, I'll make you a co-host so you'll have access there and I'll unmute you.
Hello.
You good?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can.
All right. Good.
Thanks for joining, brother.
Absolutely.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for the invite.
Roy, do you get old, bro? I mean, you don't age at all, man. You look the same as from, when I used to run to your Nab and Alpha 20 years ago.
He might be Jamaican, man. I'm gonna claim him. I'm gonna claim him, even if he isn't. You know what? I'll put you back on mute. Roy, hold on, Roy. Hold on, Roy. You're just trying to unmute you here, brother.
There we go.
There you go.
I was just saying hello, good to see you, and that we all age okay. Lucky
Some
for
better
all.
than others, right?
All right, everyone. Thank you all for joining. Just give us, we're going to give it a couple minutes past the hour before we get started. Roy, sorry, I was unmuting you, but you muted yourself. Got it. Great.
Yeah, so I think Roy, Keith may have to stay unmuted unless you make them co-hosts.
Which I did with Roy. But I'll make you a co-host, Roy. And so you should have access to do your thing. So try to unmute yourself now, Roy. There you go.
Works. Got
Good.
it. Thank you.
Good. Hello, everyone. Give us a couple minutes, just waiting until 2 or 3 minutes past the hour, and we'll get started. Mark Bowie from Memphis, Tennessee. I see you. Sorry, man. I see folks that I haven't seen in a while, at least virtually, and I got to call them out. So I apologize for that. It's been a long time, Mark. All right, we're going to get started. So thank you all for joining our Black History Month event, Our History, Our Future. And, I'll vamp here a little bit as people come into the room. It's been an interesting, not even, I guess, calendar year when you think about what's happened since George Floyd and Breonna, et cetera. And as we were coming towards this Black History Month, we just thought about, what could we do to, put a spotlight on not only where we've been as Black folk, but also some of the work that's taken place in the greater community to bring about equity for Black people in particular, but certainly Black and brown folks in general. So, we thought about providing some historical context and then striking, some themes or touching on some themes that are really future related. I had the opportunity a few months ago through the Providence Dinner Group folks, and shout out to my folks in Providence, to hear Brother Keith Stokes provide a great overview of kind of the Black experience in our history in Newport and in Southern New England. I thought it'd be great to have Keith on. So Keith, thank you for joining. and Roy Weathers of the CEO Action for Equity is on to talk about this future component. But before we get started, just a couple things. Thank you to all the sisters that are on the line. A lot of our sisters have signed up and signed up to join us this evening. So thank you all for joining my Rhode Island Day Ones at URI. I see you all. Thank you for joining. And then shout out to the Providence Men's Dinner Group, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Providence, as I mentioned, and obviously Boston for joining as well. So shout out to all you brothers. We're on Zoom, so I'm muting everyone. And as Roy and Keith present, they'll each do about a 20 or 30 minute talk, and then we'll go to about a 30-minute Q&A. So when we get to the Q&A, just raise your hand, your virtual hand here in Zoom, and we'll take questions for both of them. I'm going to pause there. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Emerson Foster, if you don't know, and I'm one of the co-leaders of this Boston Men's Dinner Group. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul Francisco to introduce himself.
Good evening, brothers and sisters. Paul Francisco, day job, lead our inclusion and diversity efforts at State Street, and then work for Emerson the rest of the time, co-leading this dinner group, in addition to being one of the co-founders of the New Commonwealth Fund, which was launched in Boston last year to combat racism and to drive social justice. So happy to see you all. Welcome, Keith and Roy. Looking forward to the conversation this evening. For those of you who are new to the group, we encourage you to stay connected and to sign up and receive the emailed notices around our events and the gatherings. So welcome, and look forward to tonight.
Yeah. And for those who may not be familiar, I know most of you are, but this is a group that's been around as the Boston Men's Dinner Group for over 20 years. And, we've been able to connect with some folks in some other cities and develop this concept in the cities that I mentioned previously. And so, the greater Black male community, I think, has taken note of what we're doing. And we certainly want to continue to grow this concern across the country. So that's who we are. Okay. Without further ado, I want to introduce my brother, Keith Stokes. And I won't read his full bio. I did send it, so I hope you had an opportunity to peruse that. But Mr. Stokes is presently the vice president with the 1696 Heritage Group. The Heritage Group is a historical consulting firm dedicated to helping persons and institutions of color to increase their knowledge and access to the light of truth of their unique American heritage. The firm draws on extensive knowledge and experience in ethnic American historical research, interpretation, programming, and product development. Mr. Stokes has a long and distinguished career in business and community development, degrees from Harvard and University of Chicago. He's also an advisor for the Rhode Island, with the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Rhode Island. And he's been a recipient of numerous local, state, and national awards. He's been on every network that you can possibly think about, talking about Black history in particular, but also Jewish history as well. He's an aficionado in that concern as well. So I turn it over to Keith to talk a little bit about our history.
Thank you, Emerson. And first of all, I'm a big red Cornell man, not a Harvard man. Cornell.
That's right.
But we had a better baseball team when I played. But I just want to thank you for this opportunity to present this, because this is something that I've been working with, and I've had the honor to work with historical organizations and historical national trust across the African diaspora, including the Jamaican National Trust, Barbados National Trust, Bahamas National Trust, Dominican Republic, Ghana, and across the United States. So the items that you'll see come from a number of different collections, particularly collections here in New England. And the stories that you hear are stories that bring a perspective from the African heritage community. And later we can talk about this because the term that I'm going to be using is less Black and less African American and more African heritage. And we can talk about that because one of the things that I've learned working in researching across the diaspora is that we are so much more than any one people based in any one geography. We're all connected back to the motherland with having an African heritage, be it from the West Indies or South America or here in America. So the title today is called Building Community, and I'm going to talk about the really early origins of African heritage institution building here in New England. And I want to begin with a very important premise, and particularly since we're at the waning days of Black History Month, and there's been lots of programs and lots of presentations across the country, across the world, but many times it weighs very heavily on the history of slavery and our ancestors' enslavement. And one of the things I've been consistently saying is that slavery is not Black history. How our African heritage ancestors survived and thrived despite enslavement is Black history. And what you're here tonight is Black history that includes some aspects of slavery and discrimination, but it also focuses on the ability of our ancestors to survive and thrive despite slavery, despite Jim Crow laws, despite the ongoing challenges of racialized bias. And in fact, the two items that you see in this slide as a part of the collections of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society are actual slave manacles from the 18th century. But alongside that is an 1854 poster celebrating the first emancipation celebration of the British West Indies. So any discussion that I begin with in African heritage history, I have to begin with Africa well before European colonization. I can't tell you how important that is. Our history didn't start with slavery. Our history didn't start in the Western Hemisphere. Our history started in the African continent. And what we know and what is well documented is that particularly West Africa, which is connected to the Americas, long before European settlement and arrival, had major civilization empires in place, including the Ghana Empire, which at the time of the colonial era would have been called the Gold Coast, Mali, Kingdom of Nuri, Yoruba people of what is today Nigeria, Akan and Ashanti of Ghana. And each and every one of these empires were specifically tied to significant global trade commerce activities, be it gold in what is today Ghana, rice, particularly going into Sierra Leone, salt and other major. And what's most important is that many of these Africans and many of these tribes and civilizations for thousands of years were tradesmen, were commerce leaders and trade leaders well before a European had stepped foot on the African continent, and particularly in West Africa. So one of the things that I consistently as using African heritage as a starting point is that the enslaved Africans who would arrive, we call them forced immigrants. And we use the term immigrant because when you think of an immigrant, you think of them bringing their language, their foodstuff, their culture, their trade, their religion. That all comes with them as land and build a new life in a new world. So did our African ancestors. They didn't blank slates. They brought their language, their foodstuffs, their religion, commerce, and their labor. In fact, from a demographic perspective, if I was to take you back to the very origins of the transatlantic slave trade, and we'll start with the year 1500, 8 years after Columbus would sail the ocean blue and begin to open up trade and settlement in the New World, as it was called, between 1500 and about 1800, that 300-year span alone, about 12.5 million people left the old world of Europe and African continent and would land and settle in the New World, which is British North America, the West Indies, South and Central America, establishing cities such as Charleston, South Carolina, or Bridgetown, Barbados, or Nassau, Bahamas, or Newport or Boston, Massachusetts. Out of that 12.5 million people who would settle over that 3-century period of time, 10 million were enslaved African men, women, and children. So just by the very scale of the number of African people who would arrive, forced immigrants, chattel property, enslaved, but who would arrive, land, settle, and then become the workforce to drive nearly all levels of economic, social, religious, civic prosperity of those locations, it has as much an African, and particularly West African influence as compared to any other ethnic, racial, or group of that time. And we know that today because if any one of us travel across the West Indies or South America or across the Americas, we're always running into an African custom. It could be a food custom. It could be a burial custom like the jazz funeral that you see in New Orleans. It could be a holiday celebration, which is called John Canoe in Jamaica and Junk Canoe in Bahamas. But what's most important to recognize is the very fabric of the founding, settlement, and economic prosperity of the Western Hemisphere has as much an African influence as compared to any other group at any other point in time. And that is the documented, validated historical facts. So that's my starting point. So as we begin to talk about who these Africans were, we know how they arrived, but more importantly, who were they? And then how would they begin to build laws from slavery to freedom in early America, and in our case, particularly early. Well, the early African benevolent organizing in America dates back to the 1730s and 40s, meaning that's where we have primary, secondary documents. It certainly could have taken place earlier, but we base it upon the documents we have in place. And by the 1740s, we begin seeing sprouting up almost simultaneously in the spring, where there are large numbers of enslaved Africans. Here in New England, we begin seeing it in Rhode Island. We see it in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Later, we begin to see it across the West Indies. And during that spring, enslaved Africans would come together for several days, and they would literally organize themselves, and they would elect a tribal leader. The white community interpreted that as mimicking colonial law, and they would call it Negro or Negro governor or African governor. But now we know by matching primary, secondary records of these activities, the West Indies and back to West Africa, this is exactly not a mimicking of English or European legal systems or political systems. This is the age-old custom of coming together in the spring and selecting your chief or your tribal leader. And in New England's case, that tribal leader next year seeing all aspects of common law activity within the African community. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of documented cases of these African tribal leaders or these African governors all across New England. So even though they arrive in the worst circumstance, the most challenging circumstance, and even as they are still enslaved, they still take the time to reclaim and maintain their African identity. And in my community of Newport, we have not only documents of these African governors, but we also have, very fortunately, today, the oldest existing African and later African-American burying ground in America. Not in Virginia, not New York City, not Savannah, Georgia, but Newport, Rhode Island, and New England. And our African burying ground dates back to 1705. And like the image that you see here of Pompey Brenton, we have a number of markers of African men who were at one point and one time these African governors. So as we begin to start to unveil Africans beginning to identify themselves as Africans in America, we also have to recognize, and this is very important. If there's anything I say tonight, I hope this resonates. The first emancipation is not 1865 at the conclusion of the Civil War. The first and most dramatic and important emancipation of African heritage people is between 1777 and 1790, immediately after the July 4th signing of the Declaration of Independence, starting with the colony of Vermont, soon to be the state of Vermont, and followed by Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York. Each and every one of those new states would abolish slavery. In some cases immediately, in other cases gradually, but they would abolish slavery. And this first emancipation, which is concluded by the end of the 18th century, it not only sets African enslavement on a fast course towards extinction in America, we still needed a civil war, but most importantly, it would create a very large population of free Africans before the 19th century. Now, I want to be clear with this. They are free, but they are still severely limited by racialized discrimination. In fact, what replaces chattel enslavement is now lawful discrimination. And it embodies later in things such as the Jim Crow law and the Plessy versus Ferguson decisions. But at least they're free. So while 90% of African heritage people are still enslaved in America, in the late 18th century, particularly in New England, there are large pockets of free African now Americans. And that first emancipation is important because they don't sit idly by. They begin to organize. They begin to reclaim and recognize that they can now seize their freedom. And seizing their freedom meant that they would begin to initiate America's earliest African civic, educational, religious institutions. And these institutions, what is most striking is as they began to be organized and named, they're not the Negro institution, they're not the Black, they're not the African American, they're not the colored. They are the African lodges, African meeting houses, African churches, African societies, African schools. Even though many of these now free Africans in America are third generation American, they still claim and reclaim their African identity. This is not something that was created in the 1960s in a Black Power movement. This was something that was initiated and established centuries before by free African people in America, and particularly in New England. And there are two institutions that represent the first two models of these free African heritage institutions. The first is Prince Hall in Boston. On March 6, 1775, Prince Hall and a dozen other free African heritage men come together and organize the African Masonic Lodge number 1, the first time in its history. Today, that lodge and all African heritage Masonic lodges bear the name of the founder, Prince Hall. By 1797, Prince Hall is working in other free communities and setting up the second and third African lodges in America at Philadelphia and at Providence, Rhode Island, and both share the name, the African Lodges 459. And this is a neat history for me because I have ancestors who were a part of the lodges in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Philadelphia, and Newport. And you can see in this image, it's an actual 1856 Masonic ritual book from my great-grandfather who had established the African Lodge, the Doric Lodge in Connecticut in the 1860s. What's most important about the African Lodge movement is it not only allows African men to organize freely without white oversight, but it also provides them some level of recognition, and not completely equal, but some level of equal treatment and recognition by their fellow lodge brothers. But what was most important is they could organize, and with that organization, it gave them the ability to plan the betterment of the African people, not only in Boston and Providence and Philadelphia, but it would extend itself across early America. And one of the most exciting things as a history nerd is there are primary documents, meaning letters, diaries, written between Prince Hall and his counterparts in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Providence, Newport, and they're talking about what is life going to be for free Africans in America. And there's some great stories behind that because the Newport Africans, they wanted to return to Africa. They would write letters and they would say, you know what? We're free now. We're tired. We don't want to be here. We don't want to face discrimination. We're going back to Africa. And a group of them would. Prince Hall, not so much. You know, I'm from Barbados. We believe I'm here now. Many of my fellow brethren are Boston born. And our feeling is that we need to make a better life and fight for a better life and demand for a better life as free African citizens right here in our country. In Philadelphia, Richard Allen, Absolute Jones, they are members of the African societies. They are members of the lodges, but they are also men of the cloth, and they would found two of the earliest free African places of worship. They believe the future of Africans in America as free citizens is the Black church. And what's fascinating about this is they're debating this amongst themselves. And this is not going on in 1890 or 1990. They're talking and debating and discussing these issues as what is life for us as Africans in America in 1790. The second important model is in Newport, my community. And we know because, again, we have the records and documents, but on November 10th, 1780, a group of free African men came together in the home of Abraham Casey. And let me point out, like Prince Hall in Boston and those in Philadelphia and elsewhere, these African men were almost consistently tradesmen and craftsmen. My own ancestor was a Windsor chair maker, and then a cabinet maker, and a mason, and a member of the Black Church. Because having access to trade skills provided a level of economic independence that allowed you to have the privilege of free time to be a mason or to be civically involved. So there is a direct correlation in interconnectivity between trade skills and economic prosperity and reinvestment in your own African heritage community. And these men did that at that time. And in the case of Newport, the Free African Union Society would establish itself and do three important things. One, eventually a group of them wanted to return to Africa. But before that, with their counterparts in Boston, by 1808, they would establish the first free African schools. Free meaning owned by Africans, operated and taught by Africans for African children. No white oversight, no Christian conversion, African schools. And it begins with the Africans in Newport and the African community in Boston. So what's important to recognize here is the starting point for African-American civic organization, which would lead to political, educational, and social organization, starts with Prince Hall Masonry in Boston and the African Union Society in Newport. And each and every one of these organizations, the African Union Society in Newport, the African Union Society in Boston, the Free African Society in Providence, the African Union Societies in Philadelphia, each and every one of those institutions would evolve into early free Black churches. There is a direct correlation between the establishment of the Black church and its foundation on not only religion, but political organization, self-help and determination, and most importantly, education and freedom. And we see that legacy to the very day. In fact, many of our greatest civil rights leaders in our African community have been men of the cloth. And that is no unusual circumstance. That was following a very well-structured, prescribed pattern that dates back to the very evolution of Black churches through these African societies. And as I've said earlier, some of the giants of early African-American history, Reverend Absolute Jones, who is the founder and first pastor of the first Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in America, Philadelphia. I'm sorry, Richard Allen. Absolute Jones is the founder, his counterpart of the African Episcopal Church at St. Thomas, simultaneously Allen and Jones in Philadelphia. What's important to recognize is, and you can see here from an extract from a letter, one of thousands of correspondence and connections by these men at the time, you have by 1789, Prince Hall sending a letter to his friends in Newport as they invite Henry Stewart, who is coming up from Philadelphia, so they could all share trade secrets and organizational opportunities and guide themselves and link themselves as now free Africans in America. The level of organization, the level of structured focus on building a better life for themselves is unprecedented in the history of America. And it should be a roadmap that guides us to the very day of our Black Lives Matter movement. And these men didn't stand idly by. They knew they were facing violence, racial violence, exclusion, discrimination at any point in any time. In fact, by the early 19th century, what we call the antebellum period, every single free African community in the North faced a series of highly racialized race riots. Philadelphia, New York, Providence, Boston, they all faced these riots based on two factors: their arrival of now new immigrants, white immigrants, Germans and Irish, who are now competing for land and jobs, and then the white elite, who are very concerned about this fast-growing, competitive, free Black community. They didn't quite know what to do with our ancestors. We know what to do with them in Virginia. They're slaves, but we don't quite know what to do with them lawfully in Philadelphia or Boston or Providence or New Haven. So we've got to somehow use laws and in some cases violence to keep them in their place. So these same free Africans would organize their own militia groups to defend their communities and, in case of need, be called up to defend their state and their country. And the earliest is the Bucks of America from Massachusetts. They actually assembled by the time of the American Revolution going forward. And then later we have in Providence the African Greys, who are actually, we have documentation, is that they march in parades in downtown Providence in the early 19th century. They're wearing African garbs and clothing to make it absolutely clear the African Greys of Providence are African. Could you imagine what the white community must have been saying in 1810 when you got 300 African men wearing lion cloth and African regalia and marching and chanting down the street? But we did that and did it successfully. And we were sending a clear message: we're here, we've arrived, and through our militias, we'll defend ourselves. And in my community, Newport, it became the Burnside Guard. So it's important that we recognize, despite the crushing challenges of overcoming slavery and discrimination, ongoing discrimination, we were not simple victims either. We fought back. We fought back by running away from enslavement. We fought back by slave insurrections. And when we were free, we fought back by education, organization, and if need be, defending ourselves with our own militias. And I just want to give you a few just interesting bios of some men. And I hope you have me come back someday, because I have an entire presentation of the women, and Black women are so much cooler than us. And they've done so much more things. So maybe you can have me back, and I'd love to show you a presentation on early African heritage women of New England. But we're doing the men today. And I just want to give you an example of some of the interesting men that are just the tip of the iceberg of the things that our ancestors did and accomplished during those times. And I'm proud of this because of my family. We've kept a lot of these artifacts, and many of these things come from my own family collection. So the first family I want to talk about is the Williams family of Boston. And the family patriarch is Domingo Williams. Domingo Williams was a leading abolitionist during the antebellum era of Boston. He lived and worked out of the African Meeting House on Joy Street. It would have been called Belknap Street at the time, but Joy Street today. Today it's occupied by the historic African Meeting House of America. Well, Domingo Williams, like many African men who were free and entrepreneurs, entered the catering business. And he became quite prosperous and quite active, but he would take the earnings from his catering business and educate his sons, and more importantly, reinvest in his community as an activist and as an abolitionist. His oldest son, Harry F. Williams, would later graduate from the New England Conservatory of Music and become one of the most well-known African-American musicians and composers of his time. And his other son, Thomas G. Williams, would follow his father in his catering footsteps, but would later become one of the most active civil rights and business leaders in both Boston, Providence, and Newport during his time. And just to give you a sense of how cool these men were, this is a flyer from 1858 from my family collection. And they're having an event and a send-off to Thomas Williams to the far west, but he ends up deciding, I'm going to go to Newport and make more money. But in any case, they have this event, and it's held in Boston. And the men who are the sponsors or the committee of the arrangement are a who's who of New England Black leaders. And I just want to extract two as an example. John P. Coburn was a Beacon Hill clothing retailer. He ran a gaming house. He was a founding member of the Boston Vigilance Committee, like the Philadelphia, New York committees, which are the parent organizations of the Underground Railroad. And he was a treasurer of the New England Freedom Association. He's also a founder and a colonel in the Massachusetts Bucks. Mark Rene de Morte is a provisioner to the Massachusetts 54th. In fact, if you know the story or if you've seen the movie, our men of color were not equally paid or equally armed or clothed. And de Morte stepped in and said, I will provide clothing. I will purchase the materials. I'll even take credit for you to purchase your own materials and clothing. And I'll even advance your payment so that you have equal pay and equal right to serve, fight, and potentially die for our country. And later he'd become a delegate of the Republican National Convention and a very active agent of equal rights. So these men coming together weren't just simply men having a good social time. Each and every one of them, as early as 1858, were significant contributors because of their entrepreneurial prosperity and wealth that gave them the privilege and opportunity to invest back into larger people's civil rights and civil actions. And my favorite person, someone that I hope each and every one of you Google, is George Thomas Downing. George Thomas Downing stands shoulder to shoulder with Frederick Douglass, who was his friend and counterpart. George Thomas Downing was one of the wealthiest men of African heritage in 19th century America. He was born in New York. His father ran a very successful oyster and catering business. He would relocate to Newport and set up businesses in Newport, Providence, Boston. In fact, in Newport, along the fashionable Bellevue Avenue. Let me just stop for a second. Have you noticed something interesting? The early African men and communities in New England, in Boston, it's Beacon Hill. In Providence, it's College Hill, where Brown University is. In Newport, we call it Historic Hill and Bellevue Avenue. Today, we see them as kind of trendy historic communities. But originally, these communities were settled, built upon by African men, women, and families who lived, worked, and worshiped there. The same communities that we may not even afford to walk through today were our communities. And it's important that you recognize that. George Downing built Newport's earliest and largest hotel along Bellevue Avenue. And he built catering and mixed-use businesses that later was called the Downing Block that still bears his name. He would establish businesses in Providence, and he would use his wealth to immediately reinvest into civil and equal rights. In Rhode Island, he would lead the charge to integrate public schools. By 1869, he would come together with other African-American men, and they would establish the American Colored Labor Union, because his thought at the time was, now that our brothers and sisters are free and emancipated after the Civil War, we can't leave them in the South as a single choice of sharecropping. We need to give them trade skills. We need to give them options, because that's exactly what was driving the first emancipation of African Americans. They had access to freedom, trade skills, and choice. And Downing passionately believed this. In fact, George Downing personally brought scores of families from Virginia up to Newport and Providence, New England to work. In fact, many of them came through the Culpeper County, Virginia. I have lots of friends from New England who all came through that Culpeper County, Virginia trail through George T. Downing. And later, Downing, because of his close relationship with Douglass, and particularly Senator Thaddeus Stevens and Senator Charles Sumner, gets a political appointment, and he's the sole operator of the members' dining room in the US Capitol. I can't tell you how important that political plum was, because he makes a lot of money, but he also is exercising lots of influence. He is at ground zero during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, and he has got the ear of Sumner, Stevens, and others, and he's guiding, and he's supporting, and he's recommending Reconstruction era policies that would benefit fellow African heritage people. So here's a man that parlays his economic and entrepreneurial success and uses it to advance political and social agenda. Can't we find brothers like that today? It worked in 1880. It worked in 1780. Why can't it work in 2021? And I just want to sum up here and just give you some sense of things, because this is one of my favorite pamphlets that we have that dates to 1902. And the African heritage men that are a part of this group, it's called the Senator Charles Sumner Political Club. And it is a political club composed of African heritage men from across New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, some New Yorkers, some from Philadelphia. And I love this flyer because my grandfather and great uncle are a part of this group. Every single one of these men that are part of this group are college educated. Nearly all of them are college educated, and all are business trade people in professional services. But to me, what is important is two things. One, the chairman of the group is William Stanley Braithwaite. William Stanley Braithwaite at that time, and then later on, was America's leading African heritage literary critic and poet. He would later relocate and become a part of the Harlem Renaissance. William Stanley Braithwaite is a significant contributor to elevating political, literary, social thought for the African heritage community in New England. And what I love about this flyer is the title, because what's happening in the early 20th century? Now the driving civil rights issue is women franchisement, women's right to vote. And here's a group of African heritage men coming together with the audacity to discuss are the mental capacities of the sexes equal. Now, I have no documentation what went on in the meeting. I don't have any information from my grandfather or great uncle. The only thing I can tell you is my grandmother and great aunt were college educated. So I'm sure if my grandfather was going home that night, he had the answer to that question. Yes, at least African heritage women are equal. So let me end there. I've tried in 30 minutes to give you a tip of the iceberg of all of the documents and histories that are waiting for all of us to uncover and share within our communities. And these images you see here come from the collections of my own family, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and it's just a small piece of hundreds of items and photographs of proud African heritage men, women, and families who, despite arriving in the worst circumstance of slavery, despite weathering Jim Crow laws in the South and Jim Crow traditions operating in New England, they survived and they thrived. And each and every one of us today stand on their shoulders. So again, thank you for having me. I'll certainly try to answer any questions you might have. And I'll certainly leave you my email because we have links to lots of websites and lots of institutions that know much more than I and are more articulate than I. But again, I'm just very fortunate to have the chance to share this with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Just, as usual, man, when you gave the presentation to the Providence folks, I was spellbound and I left really just reflecting on, am I holding up, the heritage in the way that I need to. And so, thank you for that insight and vantage point. One quick question is, can we get the presentation? That's the first thing.
Absolutely. I'll make sure I'll send it to you, Emerson, so you can have it.
And I'll make sure I'll share it. But brothers, I offer us to, again, raise your hand and you can ask your question. And I'll start quickly, Keith. When I heard you speak before, again, I started thinking about my son and what he was learning today in the classroom, right? In schools today. And I just wonder for some of our young people, getting that type of information, how that may help to kind of shape their vantage point around how they should be, conducting themselves or engaging in education opportunities, supporting each other, et cetera. And I just find that, that history in our young folks not having access to that or given access to that, I just think it just really puts them, not in a position to, understand why they're here and, what they should be focused on and how they should be supporting each other. Just curious your perspective on that.
No, Amos, you're absolutely right. I mean, history is about power and advancement. It always has been and always will be. And the great benefit of knowing your history is it gives you a validated sense of who you are and what rights you have in achieving and succeeding in the place that you live. And white folks do that very well. I have lots of dear friends who are, again, either the favorite sons of Virginia or ancestors of the Mayflower founding or anything like that. And they're prideful and they're members of the Daughters of the American Revolution or Sons of the Revolution, and they're prideful of that. Well, we have an opportunity to recover the history of our African ancestors who stood equally with those early white settlers. In fact, my ancestors arrived through the 1696 Seaflower, not the Mayflower, a slave ship. And I know that, I recognize that, I'm connected to that. And that's important to me because it gives me a sense of people that look like me were in Rhode Island well before most other ethnic white groups. So it's important to recognize that history is a tool for advancement in power. It's been consistently and strategically restricted to our children so that they wouldn't have the opportunity to recognize that, you know what? We have every right to be on Beacon Hill today because people who looked like me lived, worked, and worshiped on Beacon Hill. Or on the waterfronts of Boston or Philadelphia or New Haven or Bridgeport. I mean, I go through the list. I have documented more early African and later African-American communities before the Civil War, all clustered across the New England in almost every major New England city. And it's where we lived, it's where we worked, where we worshiped. it was ours. And they were almost exclusively either on the top of the hill or on the waterfront. And what are the most exclusive communities today in New England? On the waterfront and on the hill. And you don't see a lot of folks like us. So by empowering our children with that history, we inspire them to become the next entrepreneurs, to build wealth, and take that wealth to give them the choice to either reclaim either their place on the hill or on the water, or to give their fellow people of color the capacity to reclaim our place on the hill and on the water. That's what history is about.
Love it. Brandon, let me go to Brandon, Paul, and you can jump in.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Brother Stokes, for that presentation. Whenever I was listening, I noticed that you emphasized the fact of our identity being African, right, and keeping those roots, and not so much using the term Black. And I just wanted to, pause there for a second, only because of my experience growing up. I had, many friends from, Nigeria, Ghana, and they oftentimes would say, I don't know why you guys call yourselves African American. You're not African, And I was kind of, raised to, unify all of us. So I love the motivation behind it, of making sure that we're all united, because my uncle was always telling me, he was like, I hate how even current day West Africans are trying to act like they're more Black than we are, when we all come from a root that's even before them. But I just wanted to get your perspective on us identifying as Black men, or just Black versus African, the real difference, of choosing one label versus the other.
Brandon, I mean, I don't have the right answer. I can only offer you the answer that I've learned traveling through the diaspora and interacting with so many different people. And I choose to use the word African heritage because in my mind, that casts the widest net to anyone and everyone who wants to be included as a part of the diaspora. You could be African born, you could be Cape Verdean of African heritage, you could be Cuban, Dominican, Puerto Rican, you could be Native, because many of the Wampanoag, Pequot, and Narragansetts have African heritage here in New England. You could be biracial, multiracial. But what's most important is the one thing we all share is, at one point, one of our ancestors was a boat trip from Africa. So what I feel is very exciting is that if we look at the 2020 census, once it's unveiled, simply being Black American or African American is going to be a relatively lower percentage. And that's simply through intermarriage and identification and lots of things going on. And I'm not here to say that's good, right, or wrong. I'm saying that's just a demographic fact. And Latinos are our fastest growing population. So my sense is, from a political organization, from a wealth building, from a community building perspective, if we were to bring together all people under the tent of African heritage, that's a pretty powerful coalition. Because growing up in New England, my kids are 9th generation here. It's been frustrating having friends who are Cape Verdean, who 30 years ago, if you said to Cape Verdean, hey, you're Black, their parents kicked you out of the house, at least me. I'm Portuguese, I'm not Black. I was in the Dominican Republic 8 years ago for a presentation on the slave trade. And the first thing I said to the group of mostly scholars and business and government leaders, the one thing you have in the DR that you share with Haiti is not only landmass, you all have an African heritage. They threw me out of the meeting. One woman, very brown skinned, looked me in the eye and said, I'm not Haitian, I'm not African, I'm Dominican. I said, that's your nation of origin. What do you think your race is? But the point is, let's be honest. This is how discrimination and slavery has stripped away our African identity. It has belittled us. Every crumb of incentive that our ancestors could receive was based upon not being African, not being too Black, but being more white. So it's absolutely essential in my mind, if we're going to rebuild a community, and if Black lives and Black history matters, you come up with a concept and a process that brings us all back under the tent. And I just like African heritage. There are scholars that disagree with me, and rightfully so. But when I'm in Ghana, And I get there, and I was in Ananabo, where my ancestors began, and I met with the Fanti chief. He looked at me and said, "Oh man, you're not African. You know, what are you?" And I said, "Well, my grandmother was Jewish." And they said, "Okay, you're not African." So I finally had to pull out a picture of my grandfather, and he says, "All right, you're right. I like that. He looks Canadian. He looks Fanti." But the most important thing was, we went to the slave fortress. We went to the door of no return. The door of no return is that large door that separates the interior fort chamber and then out to the beach and then out to the ships and never to be seen again. They opened the door for me, and then everyone looked at me and said, "Keith, for you, it's the door of return." And then we drank and we hung out, and we didn't talk about slavery. We just talked about our shared culture. And that's, I can't tell you how beautiful that is, because all of a sudden, you know, they weren't looking at me with my Rhode Island accent or New England accent or being light skin or dark skin or being this or that. They were looking at me as a fellow African heritage person that took the time to come back and reconnect. So clearly I'm passionate about this because this is the life I've lived, and it's a privilege for me to have so many African heritage men and women, you know, who have set me up and supported me every step of the way so we can have this conversation today. So African heritage, I think that's the way to go. I'll stand behind it. I'll defend it. And most importantly, I just love the fact that we're all coming together and having this debate about our identity and our future, because that's what's most important.
Great. Paul?
Keith, there are 3 questions in the chat, but I'll see if I can summarize at least a couple of them. One is a question around what are your thoughts around the 1619 project? The other question has to do with, do you think, has any progress been made in terms of inculcating or integrating African history, African heritage history into American history? And what are your thoughts there? And so why don't we take those 2 questions and get your perspectives there?
I thought 1619 was outstanding. I have friends, many friends who are scholars, some of the friends who wrote and criticized it, but they were, one, intimidated by the fact that a strong Black woman could talk about her history from a Black perspective, because that's what it was about. And she's not a historian. She didn't pretend to be a historian. She's a journalist. And she was providing a journalistic perspective of the history of African heritage people in America. And that's what it is. And I thought it was brilliant. And I think most importantly, like the Black Lives Matter movement, it shook the tree. And now all of us that are either public scholars or academic scholars now have an obligation to sharpen our pencils and look a little more clearly and focus a little bit more directly in interpreting the history of African American people. So 1619 did that for us. As far as African American history, I've got great news from Rhode Island. I can't talk about other states, but today we made a major announcement in Rhode Island, joined by our Speaker of the House, our Senate President, our Secretary of State, our President of our college. Walmart Foundation gave a major grant to the state of Rhode Island through the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and a coalition of state historical groups. And we will be designing and building what we believe is the country's first African American history curriculum for K to 12 public schools. And we're very excited about this. There's been a lot of work around this. Our Black Latino caucus led the effort. Anastasia Williams, my dear friend, she led the effort. They dropped legislation simultaneously with the grant that will mandate this process. But what's most important is there are 3 buckets of programs that we'll be doing with this. 1, we will be outsourcing the actual curriculum development so we can bring in historical scholars, augmenting scholastic and documented evidence to build the units of instruction. And I can tell you, the first unit of instruction is called Africa Before European Colonization. That'll be the first thing kids learn, Africa. The second piece will be is professional development. Rhode Island College, which is our official teachers college in Rhode Island, will be leading the charge of not only curriculum design, but designing professional training for teachers. The companion bill that Representative Williams has in place is to establish an identification, recruitment, and training and placement program for more African-American teachers in Rhode Island. So it's a companion piece. And then the third piece will be a roadshow where we're going to set up online digital resources where young people, teachers, stakeholders can go online and have access to 400 years of history from 1620 to 2020. So we're quite excited about this. It was just announced today. It's taken us years to get to this level, a lot of political work, a lot of organizing work. And I feel the Rhode Island model will be a national model. And again, I want to be absolutely candid. I wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't have had this announcement today if it wasn't for the Black Lives Matter movement. If it wasn't for those young kids marching, shaking the tree, rattling people's chains this summer, we wouldn't have got the attention or even the time of day for the things that we're doing. So all the kudos go to those young brothers and sisters that did the marching and got everyone's attention. And now us old guys can step in and say, let's do some Black history. Let's do some workforce training. Let's do some affordable housing. Let's build wealth. Let's close the health gap. Whatever we want to do, we can do now because those young kids got their attention.
Awesome. Keith, one last question, and I think this, or maybe a couple questions, but this one bridges, I think, to what Roy's going to speak to in some ways. But the question is, how can we segue this education to our allies? How can we take this information and share it through the corporate paradigm? So there's a vantage point around, kind of this historical context and how it may influence what we're seeing, within that construct today.
I think the easiest answer is another project that I'm deeply involved in Rhode Island. You might have heard Mayor Jorge Alonso of the city of Providence this summer issued a Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Policy Initiative. And they are looking to be the first city in the nation, joining Evanston and some other cities, but the first to truly have an extensive research and historical understanding of the history of African heritage and indigenous slavery and discrimination from our founding in 1636 to 2020. And that will follow along with a series of public policy discussions and debates, and that will end up leading us into a series of public policy and private investment strategies towards reparations. Now, I can't tell you today what that's going to look like, and I'm leading the research piece, but what I can tell you is that the reparations is not simply about the enslavement of African heritage people in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. Reparations will be driven by and is largely tied to post-1865 and the installation of Jim Crow laws and policies and ongoing discrimination that discriminated against, isolated against, and absolutely devastated African heritage communities. So just to give you one very good example, don't get so caught up into Boston, Newport, and Providence being slave trading centers, but really focus on the urban redevelopment policies of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that stripped away and destabilized Black communities across America. And here in New England, Roxbury, Lippet Hill, Fox Point, and Providence, Newport, West Broadway, New Haven, Bridgeport, we all have the stories. So I think the strength of reparations is going to be the recent history that is so well documented that'll tie us to institutions who actively engage in redlining. We actually have a 1934 redlining map of Providence, Rhode Island, and it's every Black community. Now we'll all say, yeah, we know that, but to see it and know that it was a designated fiscal policy to determine who would get or who would not get a loan or mortgage insurance. We have some of our leading hospital institutions through urban redevelopment would wipe away largely Black communities and now have medical centers in parking lots. And again, this story plays out all across America, and it's not ancient history. It's not slavery. It's recent history. So my sense is the future of reparation policy debate will be anchored on very well documented recent history that will connect us to discriminatory practices and policies lawfully implemented by local, state, and federal governments for the exclusive purpose of discriminating against not BIPOC people, multiracial people, Black people. And I think the power of the facts and the power of the validation is going to hopefully help us turn the corner and move towards policies and investment strategies that close the health gaps, close the wealth gaps, give access to education and workforce training, all the things that Roy is doing and that we should be standing behind and supporting going forward. And again, as this simple scholar in the background, I'm really looking forward to dropping the facts on this one. Beautiful.
Keith, man, you didn't disappoint. You did not disappoint, my brother. Just really appreciate that. I will make sure that we share this presentation to everyone. It is being recorded, so we'll share that as well. We'll have that on the dinner group website at some point soon over the coming few days. But thank you, my brother. Appreciate it, and we will have you back. We're planning something at the end of this at the end of the calendar year as well, and so we certainly have you in mind, man. Just great information. Thank you.
Well, I'd love to come back talk about the ladies. I have that
Yes.
obligation.
You got that. You got that. All right. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Alistair Charles. Alistair is an executive over at PwC, and Alistair will introduce Brother Roy.
I like you calling me an executive. I feel great. I feel like I gotta tell you, I should get a raise
Hey,
now.
some folks on this line know what I usually call you, but that's
Well, listen, I'm excited to introduce this brother. We don't normally get a chance to engage, and I think the last I saw him was in San Diego. So Roy Weathers is a PwC vice chair and a member of our U.S. leadership team. And recently, Roy was named PwC Societal Engagement and Policy Solutions Leader and is responsible for working with many different external stakeholders on societal changes and important policy matters. So I want to make sure I got that out there. And, it's exciting to see Roy. It's exciting to look up and see someone that we can aspire to become within the firm. So without further ado, and I got to say, we've been trying to put this together for a long time, Roy. So thank you. And without further ado, I want to introduce Roy Weathers.
So first of all, great to be with you all, and thank you for the invite. Keith, that was incredible, and I'm thinking about 10 other places that I'm trying to get you connected into, so we can spread that. So that was tremendous, and I'm looking in the sidebar. I know we got a number of fellows on the call and a number of signatories, and I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. But I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to pick up where Keith left off. You started talking about policy. Let me just give you 2 minutes of 2 minutes more of my background, just to put it all in perspective. So I'm a partner at the firm, PwC, been there for a long time. Most recently, I ran our tax business for US and Mexico, and I'll come back to the relevance of that in a few minutes. But my background has been up through the firm, business executive, focusing on clients. About 14 years ago, I spent 2 years as our firm's chief diversity officer. Looking at Paul over there, we run into each other many times in many corridors around the country, really trying to help drive diversity and inclusion across all of our organizations. So I want to start there. What I'd love to do is frame for you a little bit of what's going on. Some of you may or may not know behind the scenes in terms of policy. So picking up where Keith left off, policies that were put in place a long time ago, policies that are missing, that will address some of the changes that we need from a systemic racism perspective, from a social justice perspective. So I want to share what's happening. I want you to be aware of it. I know we sent out some questions. I'm curious about what's happening in your organizations, but that's a sense of what I want to do. And I want you to take this back and know that there's some things happening for you to get involved in your own organizations and more broadly. So let me set the stage. So as Alistair said, I have the good pleasure of being the leader of an initiative called CEO Action for Racial Equity. CEO Action for Racial Equity. And so that started out as and came out of CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. Let me give you a little bit of framing for that. I want to make sure I keep an eye on the time here. Let me give you a little bit of a framing for that. So about 4.5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, if you recall, the police shootings throughout Texas were rampant. And our then CEO, Tim Ryan, said to a number of other CEOs, shouldn't we come together and start to do something to drive change inside our organization? So 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion was created. That was primarily about bringing CEOs together, CEO to CEO, to drive some change. There were some pledges that needed to be made around 3 things: training, making your organization safe to have a conversation, and sharing what you're doing. Important, some would say that's what you should have been doing, but it got the conversation going. we started that with about 100 CEOs. Today, there's over 1,600 CEOs and signatories inside the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. This summer, we all know what happened this summer: the killing of George Floyd, the outcry of the community led a number of those CEOs to say, is it time for corporate America to actually do more on the public policy side, the laws that are absent, laws that have accumulated in a direction that's holding folks back? Isn't it time for us to engage from a policy perspective at the federal, city, and state level as it relates to race? My CEO asked about 200 CEOs, about 150 raised their hand. Candidly, I was off doing something else. I was running one of our businesses, as I just mentioned. And he asked me, do you think we should focus on this? And I clearly was like, yeah, corporate America should focus on this. This is important that we get engaged in. And so then he asked me to be a part of it. So that notion of always be careful what you're endorsing and be careful what you ask for definitely came my direction, but I was pleased to. So what I want to focus on now is, what is CEO Action for Racial Equity? It's a fellowship. It encompasses today well over 100 companies that have provided 250 fellows for the next year to 2 years, and we're focused on the following things. So flip through the slide, please. Here's our mission: to identify, develop, and promote scalable, sustainable public policies and corporate engagement strategies that will address systemic racism, social injustice, and improve societal well-being. We all appreciate when corporate America decides to get involved and roll up their sleeves, things get done. We also appreciate that from a policy perspective, from a legislative perspective, within our sectors, our industries, areas that we care about in our respective businesses, when we need to lobby a point, we lobby a point. When we need to press relationships to drive change in public policy, there's no better system, there's no better platform to drive change from a policy perspective than corporate America. The challenge was corporate America had never focused that energy, that influence on the notion of race, on the notion of public policies that exist today that continue to be significant barriers. And that's what this platform was all about. Please, the next slide. The 4 areas that we're focused on, there's no secret to it: education, health, economic empowerment, and public safety. When you look at it, and we'll get to this in a minute, when you look at the gaps, when you look at the challenges in the Black community, and by the way, let me just frame this. That mission that I just read is for the 47, 48 million Black folks in this country. That's the focus. And many say, well, why Black? Why not? Well, part of the reason is, if you have an initiative, and we all know this from our business context, you need to focus. The other part is, by focusing on the Black community and the complex challenges that we have, when you start driving change from a policy and legislative perspective, you're helping a whole lot of folks other than just Black folks. We do our work through social justice lens: access, participation, equity, and rights. Seems like common sense, but when you couple that with the pillars and the elements of society, you clearly see the challenges that we have in our community. Go to the next slide, please. So how do we think about policy? What are we talking about? One of the reasons that I was keen to roll up my sleeves and jump into this. So I mentioned to you a few minutes ago that I ran our tax business, 11,000 folks. We have tremendous clients all over the country and the world. We all know that there was a piece of tax legislation that was passed in 2017. I'm not going to debate what you think about the policy, the good parts and the bad, but what I will tell you, in developing that legislation, corporate America played a significant role in influencing that legislation. Corporate America made its voice heard in developing and designing that legislation. So what I know from my running of this business is, if we can get the influence of corporate America to focus on the matters of race across health, education, economic empowerment, and public safety, we can get some things changed. We can get some things done. The other thing I knew is, there's a window of time. and many have discussed this window of time. It started this summer. Actually, it started long before the summer, but it culminated this summer. We see whether it's outpouring of investment in the Black community. We've seen more written on the gap analysis in the Black community by so many sources. Every consulting firm has written on it. The Federal Reserve has written on it. This is a unique time. The thing that I and many want to make sure is we don't pass this time and there are no law changes, there are no regulation changes, there are no dismantling of some of the systematic underpinning of policies that has created and allowed systemic racism to be sustained. We don't let this moment pass, we don't change laws, and we look back 5, 10, 15 years from now and say, wait a minute, what happened with that moment? We can't just rely on the goodwill of folks doing the right thing in companies, which we need. We can't just rely on the goodwill of politicians, you know, driving a perspective and having a point of view, which we need. We need fundamental law changes. So how do we think about policy? We think about it in 3 ways. We need some new laws, some new regulations. You're sitting there in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, as we all know, passed the police reform bill just before the end of the year. One of the things that we saw was that bill was on Governor Baker's desk. It had a number of components that were positive. Many thought, you know, it didn't go far enough, but it was a huge step in terms of the state of Massachusetts, in terms of the things that the state needed to continue to do. Certification board, qualified immunity, address no-knock warrants. It had a number of elements in it. That bill was sitting on the governor's desk. One of the early things that we did was we got a number of CEOs throughout the state that employ thousands and thousands of employees. We wrote a letter to the governor. We wrote a letter to the legislature. It had not been signed at that point. And our point was, do not let this calendar year pass without signing this legislation. If you have to, whatever compromises you have to do, whatever you have to do, do not let this piece of legislation pass. And candidly, I'm not sure. Governor Baker sent it back. It came back. It got signed. I'm not sure whether he would have signed it anyway, but what I do know is having 8 CEOs and their companies that signed, that employ thousands and thousands of employees was a welcome letter, and it will continue to be state by state. So what do we think about when we think about policy? New regulation that doesn't exist. Amplifying existing regulation that doesn't go far enough. In this country, opportunity zones is nothing new. States know, we know exactly where the map is, but arguably opportunity zones, by the way, which is a bipartisan perspective, doesn't go far enough. It's not doing enough in the communities where we don't have primary health organizations, where we don't have adequate education in schools. Aligning opportunity zones with investors to get what our communities really need is an example of amplifying existing regulations that don't go far enough. You need to roll up your sleeves and dive into it. You need to understand what the regulation is. You need to understand the gaps, but that's part of what we're doing on a day in and day out basis. There are regulations and rules that exist that are counterproductive. You know, the mention of redlining earlier, there are things that exist in our laws that we may or may not appreciate that slow down the improvement of the unbanked and underbanked in our community, which is significant. And so we need to dismantle those. We need to call those out. And candidly, we need to bring corporate America to the table to say, we're willing to make changes and we need our policy legislatures to feel empowered to make these changes. And then last but not least, social contracts and best practices. So there are many things that, if you think about the 1,600 signatories can do, where they don't need laws, they don't need rules. We want to make sure we get the laws changed. We want to make sure we get policies in place. So when things are not, when the current conversation is not as high, when you're not seeing anybody in the street and it feels like the window is closed, we use this moment of time to change underpinning legislation. I want to say a couple of things about the fellowship. We're a collaboration. We're not pretending that we know everything, because we don't. There's been so many organizations that have spent decades driving perspectives for the Black community that we are listening to and engaging with. And if you're out there and you have perspective and we're not connected to you, we want to be connected to you. I say all the time, and I know there's a number of fellows on the call, I talk about the superpower. So I think we're trying to put together two superpowers to drive a change for the Black community. Number one, our fellows. We're very fortunate. When you look at our 250 some odd fellows, we have lawyers, we have accountants, we have economists, we have data scientists, we have people with human capital backgrounds, we have people with diversity backgrounds, we have people who have spent time in their government affairs organizations, from lobbying organizations. Those are talented individuals that are waking up every day, focusing on those 4 areas for the Black community, digging into the law and understanding the rules at a federal, state, and city level. That's a superpower. We're very fortunate for that. We don't have to spend money. We don't have to spend time raising funds for that group. Our signatory CEOs and organizations have invested. The second superpower is understanding and asking our corporations to carry the water, to pick up the phone and make the call to the governors and the legislature to use their influence on matters that we identify. Go to the next slide, please. There's nothing secret here. This is when you think about the areas in the Black community, and I'm happy to engage on any. It ranges from the fact that in this country, there's $23 billion spending gap between the best public schools and the worst public schools. And guess where a significant burden of that falls? It's in our community. When you look at the unbanked and underbanked in our community versus others is significant. We do work and talk with organizations like Brookings, and you may have heard and know of Andre Perry, who's really talked a lot about appraisals and the differentiation in what a home appraises for. How are you going to build wealth when the appraisals in one community is at one level and in another community is at another level, same home, same square footage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many areas when you look at health. One of the examples I like to call out is telehealth. So you may or may not know this, but telehealth was not covered pre-COVID by Medicare and Medicaid. Telehealth is a godsend in a community, our community, where the primary health is the emergency room. It's a $2,000 visit. And it's hoping that you can last until Friday so you don't have to miss any time at work. Telehealth is one opportunity for us to skip the line with innovation. Well, today telehealth is covered by Medicare and Medicaid, but that's only because it's a pandemic. The minute the pandemic is over, that goes away. There's data that says you build trust. There's data that says there's preventive opportunities for us to continue to have telehealth. That's one of the things we're looking at getting behind to make sure our community is starting to move progressively as it relates to health. Go to the next slide, please. Go to the next slide, yeah. So just to highlight, a lot of people have conversations about many organizations being involved. Is it real? Do they care? What's happening inside the organization? And all those are great questions. But the point that I want to make to you, and the point that I settled on myself when I stepped into this opportunity, is their brands, their CEOs, the fact that they employ millions of folks in the state, that carries weight. We can identify, the platform and others can identify the changes we need. We need to, yes, activate these folks to carry the water for us, as I like to say. But this is a governing committee. This is a group, the initial group of CEOs that came together. We're updating them all the time on things we're looking at, whether it's in policing, whether it's in health, whether it's in education or economic empowerment. Go to the next slide, please. The next two slides, just a highlight of the companies that are involved. Many of you may see your company on here, and part of sharing, and the reason that I'm happy to come on today, is we need to know this exists. We need to know this platform exists. We need the input from many of you out there. If your organization is on this list, there's one more, go to one more page. If your organization is on this list, ring the bell inside that organization. What's going on? What are we doing? How are we getting involved? I tell people all the time, when I think about the work of diversity, I used to say this all the time because, you know, in my organization, you know, coming up, there weren't many people who looked like me. And I found myself having many conversations about the notion of diversity. And different people would have different perspectives on why they wanted to get involved. And I used to say, head, heart, wallet. I actually don't care. Just pick one. Pick one that resonates with you, because we have a lot of work to get done. And so this platform is about unearthing the policies that need to go away It's about identifying ones that need to exist, whether it's at the federal level. I know there's a federal agenda, but we can't take for granted that that's going to happen. Whether it's at the state level, there are a number of states looking at, for example, Illinois just passed something on policing reform. There are other states that are trying to take that lead. You heard Keith talk about education in the schools. There's so many opportunities for corporate America to drive its voice. And this platform is about identifying those things, rolling up our sleeves, and making sure we take advantage of this moment in time. So I'm going to pause there. Happy to open it up for questions. I'm just passionate about not letting this moment pass and stay at 50,000 feet and not get down in the weeds of the legislation and policy that needs to be changed throughout this country. So when we look back, we have more protection than just the goodwill and the good-heartedness of folks. We have the laws directed in a way that makes that sustainable. So I'm going to pause and happy to take
Thanks,
questions.
Roy. Appreciate it. And again, raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll go to well, let me start. I'll start by asking the first question, Roy. And one of the things that I think about is, and you're right, staying high level and being able to drive change that is more longer term. I always worry about with or initiatives like this, that it gets so esoteric that it doesn't, it doesn't stick, right?
Mhm.
And so, when I think about the signatories, and you mentioned it, you look back into their organization, it's easy to put pen to paper, right? But what are the actual actions are they driving within their organization to kind of move the needle in a different way that is not, esoteric, and it's really about an action as opposed to, just some strategy that's
Tagline, yeah.
in a deck,
Yeah. Look, I think CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion was created just for that, inside your four walls, right? And what are you doing? And how do you drive the conversation? How do you drive change? And I get the question all the time, Roy, do you think these organizations have credibility to ask politicians to support legislation that improves the lives of Black Americans across those four things? Do you think they have the credibility? And I had a conversation with a CEO about this. I'm not going to name names. And he said to me, well, I'm in the room anyway. I'm having a conversation anyway. If I can bring the conversation in the room to help drive change from a legal, legislative, policy perspective, I'm here to do that. Tell me what I need to know. Tell me what I need to do. And so to answer your question directly, different companies are going to be on different journeys. And I've seen companies go from 0 to 60 fast, and I've seen some that, I'm shocked. One of the things that we did in our firm is we put out a transparency report. You should Google it, right? PwC transparency report. We opened it up. We opened up the closet. Everything you want to know about us from a diversity perspective. One of the things that our CEO said, the reason we did it, I mean, and trust me, we debated it long and hard from an executive team. Do we want to just, put all of our numbers out there? Do we want to put all the facts about who we are from a diversity perspective out there? And our CEO said, yeah, I want to do it for a couple of reasons. Number one, no one's perfect. We're going to be pushing this agenda. We don't want anybody to believe we're perfect. We got a lot of work to do, number one. Number two, I want to hold future CEOs accountable of our own firm. So I'm going to put it out there, and that's the marker, and everyone should improve. But the third one was, I want to challenge every other organization. I want to challenge every other CEO. I want to challenge our competitors. I want to challenge our clients. So Google it, PwC, transparency report, take it to your CEO, show it to them, because that's the kind of stuff we need to do to continue to drive each other. But the work I'm talking about that I'm involved in is for the millions of Black folks that are not sitting inside a corporation.
Hey, Roy, one of the questions that was put out there, and I'll phrase it in a little bit different way. There's been so far pledged close to, I think it's $60 billion, right? Post George Floyd, from companies sort of committing to driving change and sort of putting some BlackRock, 100 million, JP Morgan, $1 billion, et cetera. So is the CEO Action for Equity sort of looking at that pool of potential money to say from an economic development, from a healthcare disparities, from all the 4 pillars work, and saying, can we convene, right, some of those organizations who have make these pledges and understand where those monies are going, understand have they gone out the door? Because one thing is to pledge, the other thing is are those money making it to where they need to go? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you're right, and actually the amount is a little over 60 billion. When you think about just the pharmaceutical arena alone is well over 6.5 billion. JP Morgan, as you highlighted, 30 billion. So the first question I got, Paul, was, do you think they're really going to spend this money? You think they're really going to spend the money? You think they really, it was just an announcement. And one thing I said, and this is the accountant side of me, was, well, first of all, in an ESG environment, it's a little different than it was 10 years ago saying you're going to do something you're not going to do it. I don't spend a lot of time worried about whether organizations are actually going to spend the money. What I worry about, and I'll get directly to your question, is how do we take the 60 billion and create 120 billion of impact? Like, how do we take the 60 billion and create what I call escape velocity for our 48 million, for the 48 million Black folks in this country? Because that's the kind of start that it can have. So one of the things that we're focused on is our ecosystem. So I'll just use business diversity. Some people call it supplier diversity. The fact of the matter is, our community, there are a number of places for that money to go, but candidly, there are a number of places where there needs to be more ecosystem focus. We need governance. We need support. We need advising. It's just dropping millions of dollars without some of the other pieces and components. And John Rogers from RL Capital, you saw, was on our governing committee. He talks about this a lot. He's like, you don't need just capital, you actually need customers. And so thinking about, and I don't want to get too deep into details, but thinking about the ecosystem of the Black community and business, and thinking about $60+ billion is one of the things we're focused on. It is true that everyone is sort of going in different directions. And part of the frustration that many feel is, well, wait a minute, if you could somehow bottle this, if you could somehow channel this, it would go in the right direction. I personally feel like it will be months before that's actually happening. I think there's some positive things happening now. The other challenge we have, we were talking about this the other day, is a number of folks who have grown up in corporate America. Many of us who've grown up in corporate America. Governance background, strategy background, legal background, are not involved in the Black companies where some of this investment is going. So one of the challenges that we all are going to have to deal with, right? Because you got the capital, there are plenty of Black businesses, but those Black businesses need the level of support that they today don't have, so that they can turn that capital into legacy building growth. And there's a lot of expertise on this call that are not sitting out there in those companies. There's expertise on this call that are not advising or have relationships with those companies. That's going to have to change. So that's a long-winded answer, but one of the things I would tell you is the ecosystem of how companies not just give the money, but also provide support is one of the things we're pushing on. But that's not going to solve it. That's not going to turn 60 billion into 120 billion. It's going to actually take some of us being more hands-on, maybe changing some of the things we're doing. I'm just being really candid, and bringing some of that experience that we have to those businesses to ultimately make this work, Paul.
Yeah. So, Roy, you touched on the pillars. One question was, how do you decide what priorities to address under,
the 4 pillars?
Yeah. And are there a few short-term? Glenn Arnold, thank you for the question. A few short-term or more long-term? And I'll just add another piece to that is, are you guys delivering a yearly report? Like, what are you giving back to the populace to say, hey, this is where we are, this is what we've done,
Yeah,
this is where we're going, et cetera?
Yeah. So great questions. And we're a bit of a startup in many ways, because I would tell you, my CEO mentioned this to me in July, and we launched October 1. And so we started ideating with our fellows, and we came up with over 300 areas to focus in across those 4 areas. That's just how much stuff is out there. As a group, we've narrowed it down to 15 that we're focused on, and we're zeroing in on 5 to 8 that we call domino areas, meaning if you attack this area, you by default are hitting education, health, and economic empowerment. We need to get started. And so we're coming out and launching our 5 to 8 in the April timeframe. There's been one of the big challenges is so many areas in the Black community to focus on, And so April timeframe, you're going to see the 5 to 8. I'll tell you, there are areas when you think about policing, when you think about public safety, there's areas cash bail, open file. There's so many areas that we need to address. And so taking it from 300 down to 5 to 8 has been the work we've been working on over the last 4 or 5 months, and we're about to land that, and you hear a lot more about it. And yes, the report out will be coming as well. What we hope to do is to start helping getting some laws changed throughout the states and cities and clearly at the federal government. One of the things, this is an example, the president asked each of the agencies to go back and do a 6-month review on their areas, looking for areas where they have issues from a systemic racism perspective, policies don't align. We're going to be rolling up our sleeves and weighing in on those agencies because we have a point of view on what they should be thinking about. If you think about the agencies, not just the DOJ, but the agencies, the FDIC and some of the agencies that controls banking and financing. When you look at some of the health agencies, even the education department, those are opportunities for us to weigh in and shape how they're thinking about what they're doing. And so those are the things we're going to be doing now while we're working on our 5 to 8.
Yeah. A quick question around metrics. If I remember correctly back, that there was this Boston Globe study. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Roy, and obviously you are. And I think one of the issues with that study is, I think as they went out to, member companies here or companies here in Boston, no one wanted to provide any metrics, right? They kind of, for whatever reason. And I know of another company that I know well that is just deathly afraid of, kind of bearing their soul, if you will, to the world around their metrics. And so how can we continue to put some pressure on these organizations to and hopefully get them to a comfortable place to really open up and really show, because ultimately that's part of the discovery, right? You can't attack an issue until you're clear as to what the issue is, and metrics are a part of that, and too many aren't willing to share that with the greater community.
Yeah, look, I'll go back to what we did. We put out that transparency report because the truth of the matter is even this platform, bringing companies together to support public policy issues, I want to come back to your question, collectively is where the comfort zone is. Asking a company to do something by themselves, a bit more of a challenge. Bringing them together and doing it collectively is something they can get their head around. And so that's why we did CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. We put out that transparency report to create some peer pressure. We put out that transparency report to show people how it can be done. And there are others that a large pharmaceutical company right now is trying to figure out how they put out their transparency report. So part of it is somebody's got to go first. I think the other answer is it's the question that I know you sent out to everyone on the call. If there are coalitions, if there are platforms, get your company involved, because what I've seen, whether it's driving a policy from a tax legislation perspective or anything else, when companies get together and there's many in numbers, they're more ripe to act. That's what I would say. Look, brand, companies spend a lot of time focused on brand and reputation. And today, just picking up where Keith left off, if you're sitting on the sidelines and you're not doing anything in this space after this summer, that's what's hurting your brand. And you see companies trying to get engaged and get involved. And again, what I wake up every day is trying to take advantage of this moment to change laws.
Can we get the presentation, Keith? Roy, sorry.
Absolutely.
Roy,
absolutely.
Can we get that? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? I mean, very important work, and I got to get my hand on that transparency report. definitely going to utilize that. Any other questions?
There's a question as to Roy, how do people get involved? Whether it's a fellow, do they have to come through their organization, and do they have to be signatory organization in order for them to be fellows, or how do you instruct people as to how to join?
So great question, Paul. So we were looking at our signatories as a primary source of fellows. It's back to the question that was just asked. Those 1,600 companies, their CEO has to take a pledge to do those three things. So if your company is not a signatory, I'd send them to CEO Action CEOaction.com, CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, and get them to sign up and be a signatory. And that's the primary source of fellows. It's not all companies, they're not-for-profits, so small companies, large companies, so I would say that's a great place to start. The other thing is we have an advisory network, so we understand that a lot of folks don't have time to move away from their careers, to give a year or 2 years, and we have a growing advisory network. So if you reach out to CEO Action through the same website I just mentioned, you can learn about our advisory network. Our advisory network, we have about 80 professionals in it that range from all backgrounds. We use the group to help us with focus group questions. There's some incredible experts that we go to help understand and identify areas that we need to focus. So the advisory network, if you can't go full-time, those are not necessarily signatories, but I would encourage you, and again, this goes back to how do you make companies change? Get them in with other companies that are driving change.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would say, Roy, is with this group, I mean, there's a lot of passionate brothers, on this call. Obviously, they all can't speak, but and a lot of doing great things and have a lot of experience in this area. So, as you're going about your work with the group, if there's an opportunity to be a sounding board or pass things through, or have folks take a look at something and kick the tires on something, let's definitely do that within this group. I think you'll get
absolutely
great engagement from these brothers.
Hey, I want to make sure there's a question that Bert has been trying to ask, which I think is a really relevant one, Roy. So he's following up on the question before about HR1. So is the coalition doing anything about voter suppression and other civic engagement type of efforts that are connected to and fundamental to public policy?
Yes. So there are a number of ideas that have come through our ideation around voting. One of the things that we're looking at, 2 areas we're looking at, is we call it a place-based, where we're going to pick 5 cities around the country. We're going to dive deep into those cities. And as you would imagine, it's going to be based on where Black folks are, where the needs are, et cetera. But voting is going to be a core piece. Civic engagement is also very important to us. One of the things that we really don't focus on, but it's true, that local, whether it's the school board or whether it's even the tax assessors, those roles impact our lives on a day in and day out basis more than we think. And we have got to get our folks ready, willing, and able to take on those roles. So voting is incredibly important, but we shouldn't go vote for someone else and hope that they actually think about us, take care of us. We need to start to step up ourselves and take on some of these local roles, because that's where the change is. I like to say, if I'm making the rules, I'd rather be making the rules than taking the rules from someone else any day. And that's, so civic engagement is one of the areas that we're going to be driving really, really hard as we move forward in terms of the platform. And there's some great organizations that are already doing that. And so we're finding ways, how do we support them? How do we expand that?
Awesome.
So can I just on a final note, I just wanted to say, we're in I think a once in a generational moment right now from so many perspectives. The awareness, the actual dollars. There was a great article that just came out. Every time I pick up the phone, it's another CEO that wants to find a way to contribute. I just ask us to remember 2 things. As I said, diversity, people get into it, head, heart, wallet. There are going to be a lot of companies that are getting into it because of their brand, their reputation, and wallet. That's okay. Let's take advantage of the moment. There's others that are going to get into it because it's the right thing to do. That's okay. Some are going to get into it because of the metrics and the peer pressure that we talked about. That's okay. So that's one point. The other point I want to make is the laws and the policies matter. Arguably, it's been 70 years since there's been any meaningful look at our existing laws from a federal, state, and city perspective as it relates to race. It may not be exciting. It may not be the thing that's the buzz. It may not be the thing that creates all the attention. But let us not, please, let us not let this moment pass and not change some of the underlying laws and policies that will impact generations to come. Because good people come and good people go. We need to get laws and policies in place and change. So that's what I wake up doing every day. I'm asking you to think about that. There's stuff right in your purview. When you start thinking about it, you start asking about it, you'll see. And I just ask that we as a group of folks not let this moment pass without changes in laws and getting some better policies in place. Thank you for the time.
Great, Roy. Thank you, man. Awesome. All right, Paul, any last words?
Nothing, man. Just inspired by both Keith and Roy, the messages tying, the rich African heritage and the proud and the pride of the institutions that were built, right? And that needs to continue. And to Roy's point, this is a pivotal moment that we can't let pass, man. And I'm just really excited that you are at the forefront of doing this, Roy. I know you're not going to let it go. And I know that the 250 plus fellows that are working with you are just really committed and dedicated to doing this work, and all those CEOs are part of it. So kudos to you and the work, man. But what I'm afraid of is that the momentum will stop. And I think that coalitions like yours will continue to make sure that doesn't happen, right? That this continues. So thank you, man, for being here. We know how busy you are, and Keith. So we really truly appreciate it, and the men and women of the group really do appreciate it as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Pete. All right. So hopefully we'll be back together again in a couple months. I as you all know, the best thing about our group is when we have an opportunity to network. I actually had put together an event in January, which I don't think any of you got my emails because I was transitioning from my former life into my new role, and I just didn't have everyone's contact. But I think I'm going to do that again so we can just come back and network with each other at some point in the near future. But we'll be back together again soon. We'll get you both presentations. And then also, our sisters, next month is Women's History Month. There are quite a few events taking place. One by someone who I know called it's the 9th Annual Mavens Conference. Someone I know very well is putting that on. And I think it's a great conference. We're going to, she will have the SVP and Chief HR Officer of Major League Baseball. And then also just a terrific leader out of the Hollywood community that have broken the careers of many, many actors and actresses on that event. So support our sisters as well. And we'll share that in the email to all of you as well. So enjoy the rest of the night. Hope to see you all soon, and take care.